moment. Hold on, let me just click out that. All right. And so, and then we can have some questions at the end. And this is a self-portrait of me. You can see me in the background. This is a small sea cave along the coast of Lake Superior. And I think one of the first rules I'm going to talk about is how to do self-portraits. And there's really only two rules to self-portraits, which are suck in your gut and push out your chest. That's the best way to make yourself look good in a self-portrait. So in any event, I'm going to be talking, oops, sorry. Keynote sometimes freaks out and zips ahead. I'm going to be talking about some of the techniques that I discuss in great detail in my Ultimate Photography Composition course, which is a multi-hour video course. And that's combined with my over 200 and almost 300 pages ebook called Visual Flow, which is really my personal opus about the subject of photographic composition. And so I'm going to be just giving you a small slice of that overall discussion of composition that is in my Ultimate Photography Composition course. Now, let's start off with what I consider to be the keys to making extraordinary photographs. So first of all, I think that when you're making a photo, you should be seeking to go past making a mere documentary record of what you're photographing. So you're not just out there to take pictures of things and events that are happening around you. There's certainly nothing wrong with taking that documentary approach, but I think the best photographers manage to go past that. And instead, what they do is they find a way to impose their own artistic vision on the subject that they're photographing. And really what you're striving to do is to make photos that tell viewers as much about you as about your subject. So the very best photos don't just record a moment or a scene or a subject. They impose something extra, something else onto the photograph to make it more compelling and to invite the viewer to be part of what it is that is being photographed. Let me just take a step back and talk about what exactly is composition. So composition is, at its most basic level, a visual structure imposed upon an artistic expression. And I'm using that very general language because composition can apply not only to photographs, but to paintings. It can apply to music, to poems. And really, it's the structure that you impose upon whatever it is you're trying to create. And that's a bit dry of a definition. So I like to go forward and talk a little bit more about the emotional visual aspects of composition. So a good composition should tell a story about the subject. And I get this question a lot from people. They'll say, well, does every photograph have to tell a story? And the answer I give is yes, every photograph should tell a story, but I have kind of a loose definition of what it means to tell a story with your photographs. I think the key thing to telling a story is to get the viewer aroused by your photograph. I mean that in like a curiosity sense. You know, you want to arouse an emotion. You want to make them curious about what it is that they're seeing in the photograph. And that's the key to telling a story, because when you're telling a story with your photos, there might be the real story. There might be the story you're trying to tell, but ultimately the viewer is going to build their own story. They're going to construct their own narrative about what's going on. So the key thing is to have these cues within your photograph, or this element of mystery that gets the viewer curious. It arouses some sort of emotion or thought process, and that is going to give them a deeper connection with your photograph. So you really want to figure out a way to entice the viewer emotionally into your scene, and also visually. And I'm going to be talking a lot in this presentation about the visual aspects of composition and a little bit less about the emotional storytelling aspects. But that visual pull that you're trying to create with a good composition, with a strong visual design, that is going to have a profound impact on the viewer's interaction with your photograph. And it really is inviting viewers to see the world through your eyes, which I think is the whole purpose of making photographs. And as always, no matter what I say, no matter how long I take to say it, Ansel Adams probably has a quote somewhere that sums it up in less than 10 words. And so I think this Ansel quote is a good example of that, where he said, you don't take a photograph, you make it. That's the whole point I'm trying to get across here. You're not just out there taking photos. You're not just out there taking snapshots. You're making artistic photographs. You're making artistic compositions. You are in control of the visual design. And often as photographers, especially if you're doing a lot of photography outside, like I am with nature, wildlife, and travel landscapes, you're really kind of at the mercy of the elements. The landscape looks a certain way. The light on the landscape is out of your control. The weather, all that stuff going on, what people are doing in your travel photographs is a lot of times out of your control. But what you can control is your framing of the scene, where you stand, how you get objects in the scene to line up. The composition is something that is entirely under the control of the photographer. And that's why I think it is the most important part of the photographic process. So as long as you keep this quote from Ansel in mind, that you're not taking a photograph, you're striving to make an artistic composition, I think that is a very good basic foundation that will help you see more creatively. Now, when I talk about composition, there is a few things I don't like talking about. And there's one really big elephant in the room that I have to mention. I always try to do my presentations without talking about it, but I have to at least mention it so that I can spell it and then move on. And so the one thing that you'll never hear me talk about, except for this moment right now, is the rule of thirds. And of course, I think most of you have learned the rule of thirds at some point, perhaps had it drilled into your head. Basically you divide the photograph horizontally and vertically into thirds, and you place important objects on those third lines. It's kind of a basic guideline that a lot of photographers learn early on. But I kind of feel like it's just a made up rule, and that it might be a little bit helpful in the beginning, but it's like training wheels on a bicycle. It can help you learn how to ride a bike, but until you take the training wheels off, you're not really riding a bicycle. I guess with four wheels, it's a car, basically. It's like a Flintstones car that you power yourself. And it's the same thing with the rule of thirds. At best, it is a set of training wheels. And I think it's a good idea just to, throw the rule of thirds out the window, burn it up. Sorry, I like dramatic keynote effects. And I stress this because I know the camera clubs in particular are usually places where the rule of thirds is very deeply embedded. And a lot of times when I am looking at photos taken by clients in my workshops, or when I'm doing the thing that I see that really gets in the way of making good images the most is when people are using the rule of thirds. A lot of times I'll ask someone, I'll see a composition and it won't feel quite right to me. And I'll say, oh, did you use the rule of thirds? And someone will say, yes, I use the rule of thirds. Or they'll say, well, not consciously, but my camera's got this rule of thirds grid on the LCD screen and I lined up my composition using that grid. And often it was using the rule of thirds that made the composition less effective, that by not using the rule of thirds, the composition would have been stronger. So I feel like I've just kind of got to force people to unlearn what they've learned about the rule of thirds. And as a matter of fact, I feel that way about the phrase rules of composition overall. I really don't like it. Just want to throw those out the window, put them in the garbage, set them on fire. What I like to say is that rules are for fools, and the smart photographer uses tools instead. So when I talk about composition, I talk about tools, artistic, creative tools that you can use. And not every tool is right for the job. Not every tool is right for the subject of the scene that you're photographing. So when you need a screwdriver, you wouldn't use a sledgehammer and vice versa. And the great thing about photographic composition is that a lot of these tools are kind of mix and match. It's like going to a tapas restaurant. You don't have to order just one meal. You can order a bunch of small plates of all sorts of different things. And the same thing with composition. Often you can use several different tools at the same time. So that's why I don't like the rule of thirds or these rules of composition, because I think they can be a little bit helpful in the beginning, but overall they're going to inhibit your growth. And so what I like to do is bring people down to core principles of visual design and just kind of work from there. Start with the building blocks and then get into some of the more advanced tools. And that way you can pick the right tool for the job. Sorry, was there a question or comment from someone? Okay, I heard some noise. So, so And just to be clear, I don't have any formal training in art or anything like that. Everything that I talk about is completely made up by me. So some people might look at that and say, well, everything he's saying is completely worthless. And you're probably not wrong about that. But I have thought about this a lot, and I've built my own framework for thinking about composition that I actually think works pretty well and is effective at getting people to think more creatively about composition. So I'll be presenting you that completely homemade framework that I use. Feel free to think about composition in a different way. I mean, if you've got an art background, you probably learned some of these concepts, but they might be called something else, or they might be thought of in a little bit different way. Or come up with your own way of thinking about it. I think that's all perfectly acceptable. The key thing is to actually think critically about it and to try to figure out what works and what doesn't work. You want to move past saying about a photo, I like it or I don't like it, to thinking about why do I like it or why don't I like it? What's working, what's not? And once you start, taking these subjective reactions that you have and transforming them into well thought out objective principles, that's when your composition skills will get much better. So the key thing is to think in the abstract. This is, I think, the most basic of those basic building blocks that I talk about. So you want to stop thinking about your subject in terms of what they are. You want to think about what else they are. So instead of seeing a tree or a bear or a rock, you start thinking about your subjects or the objects that might be in the scene that you're photographing in terms of shape, line, space, and color or luminosity value if you're shooting black and white. And once you start doing that, once you start breaking down the world into all these shapes and colors and seeing how the shapes and colors interact, you realize that you don't really need extraordinary subjects to make a compelling composition or make an effective photograph. You start seeing how the shapes all work together, and you realize that a beautiful subject and a beautiful photograph are two different things. You can take a beautiful photograph of a beautiful subject. You can take a beautiful photograph of a not beautiful subject. I mean, some of the most famous photographers made their career photographing things that other people wouldn't think about photographing. So think, for example, of the work of Henri Cartier-Bresson, arguably the most famous street photographer. I mean, a lot of times he was walking around photographing mundane people and things, the kinds of things that other people might not notice or care to even photograph. He wasn't walking up to the most gorgeous Italian supermodel he could find on the streets. He was, working with average people, normal people, just objects. And really, if you look at his work, he's not photographing people per se. He's photographing the interaction of shape and color, or in his case, because most of it was black and white, the interaction of shape and brightness and darkness. So shadows and light and all that sort of thing. And that is when you realize that you shouldn't be thinking about your subject as the subject. The subject is just a part of the overall composition. So you might be going out to photograph this beautiful mountain peak, or you might be going out to photograph this gorgeous Italian supermodel. But if you're making an artistic composition, you realize that the subject isn't really the subject. The subject is part of the overall composition. The entire composition is the subject, and the subject is really maybe the center point, the focal point of your composition. And so once you kind of internalize this, once you start seeing the world in terms of shapes, you realize that you can make photographs that are effective, even if you're photographing something that most people might not think is that photogenic or interesting. And the photo that's on this slide is an example of that. It's not one of the most beautiful photos I've ever taken. It's not in my portfolio. You can't go to my website and see this photo. This is a photo I took in Namibia many years ago. I was leading a tour, and we had two shooting destinations that were a very far drive from each other. And so we stopped at a midpoint to lodge overnight. And it was a place kind of in the middle of nowhere. It was a pretty spot, but I'd never been there. And it wasn't really dramatic scenery. You couldn't walk around and see any big mountains in the background or anything like that. So I went out in the morning with my clients for sunrise, and it was basically like, well, let's just see what we can find. And we walked around, and there was this little hill. We climbed up to the top of the hill, and I thought it might be a nice vantage point for sunrise, but I really couldn't find anything interesting to photograph. And then I saw this tree that was on the hill, and it wasn't a super interesting tree. It was kind of, gnarly, had this really gnarly shape. But the more I looked at it, the more I realized that through the photographic process, we could transform it into something that would be photogenic, that would be interesting to take a picture of. And with a wide angle lens, when I got in close into the branches, suddenly those branches transformed into these radial lines. And, so it created this radial pattern with all these lines and curves coming in from the corners and edges of the image into the central part of the composition. And then knowing that the sun was rising, we decided to include the sun star as a focal point in the composition. And so what we did during this exercise was we created something out of nothing. We took something that was completely mundane, something that no one else would have thought of photographing, and made an effective photograph out of it. Once again, not the most brilliant thing I've ever shot, but nonetheless, I am proud of the fact that I was able to go to a place and just find some ugly tree, looked kind of like Charlie Brown's Christmas tree. It needed a little bit of love to make it stand up tall and to be worthy of being a photographic subject. And the love came from engaging in this process of thinking about visual design in an abstract way. So just a few examples of photographs that show you how you can be juxtaposing abstract shapes and colors to make creative design. So this is a photograph I took of Devil's Tower in Wyoming. And Devil's Tower is photographed a lot. And most of the photos look very similar to each other. It's just this big tower sticking up from the surrounding landscape. And I went there hoping to make something very creative, something that hadn't been done before. I wanted to take an original photograph of Devil's Tower. And I realized why there weren't very many original photographs of Devil's Tower, because there's really only a few vantage points where you can see the tower sticking up around from out of the trees. And they're all kind of from a distance. And basically, the tower looks pretty much the same from any angle. So there's really not that much room for a lot of compositional creativity. And I spent hours walking around the base of the tower on this trail, thinking that maybe I could find some, I don't know, interesting tree shapes to frame it, or some boulders I could juxtapose as a foreground to the tower in the background. No luck whatsoever. I was about to give up. And I kid you not, about 50 feet away from the parking area, as I'm walking back to my vehicle, I see this flat boulder with a rainwater pool on it. And I walk over to see if I could reflect the tower in it. Sure enough, I was able to get the reflection of the tower in the pool. So I said, aha, this is perfect. I've got an interesting composition. This will be a very unique take on the tower. All I have to do is wait for sunset, so I get that golden light on the tower to juxtapose against the cooler blue tones that would be on the rock and the water in shadow. And so I sat down and waited for about 2 hours until sunset came. And I must have seen dozens of photographers walk by, and not a single one even looked over, until at one point this woman walks by. She had a tripod over her shoulder. She stopped, she saw me, and she said, "You've got the best shot here, don't you?" And I said, "Yep." And then she said, "And you're not going to move." And I said, "That's right." So I kept waiting, got the shot. And this is just an abstract study of shape and of complementary colors, the blues versus the gold. They are opposite colors, so that makes for a very vibrant color palette. And those things working together allowed me to create this composition. Here's another example. This was from Mongolia. I was there last February when the pandemic first became a global pandemic. As a matter of fact, I almost got trapped in Mongolia because the entire country shut down immediately. And it was only through some creative bribery from my guides and through the entire tourism industry in Mongolia lobbying the government to open up travel for tourists so that they could get out of the country, that I was able to make it back to the capital and then catch a flight back home. I was there to photograph the Gobi Desert, these massive sand dunes. And one morning it was a bit cloudy, and so I knew I wasn't going to get any good light on the dunes. So instead of hiking into the dunes, I decided to fly my drone to see if I could find anything interesting. And as I was flying, I saw this frozen river, and it had this, really great shape in places. So I flew the drone until I had all of these curves in the river. And so I knew that shape was really going to make this an interesting composition. And I just needed a few more elements to bring it all together. I was waiting for the sun to pop up above the clouds just enough so that the ice on that frozen river would reflect all of that, so that shape would really stand out then from the rest of the surrounding terrain. And so instead of photographing these massive sand dunes, in this photo, the sand dunes are really pushed to the background. They're just sort of a small element within the overall composition. And it's the shape of the river that's revealed by that first hint of sunlight as the sun comes out from behind the clouds that really makes this composition work. And I'm always thinking about shape, even when I'm photographing wildlife or people. Shape is really the most important thing about composition. So learning to see shapes, learning to see how objects might interact to create shapes is very important to composition. So here, this is a photograph I made in Uganda of a family of mountain gorillas, the silverback in the front. The moment when a bunch of the gorillas came out to lay together was really what I was waiting for. And I chose a position so that the gorillas all overlap just a little bit. And working together, all of these gorillas form this C shape, this sort of S curve almost, that leads the eye from foreground to background. So that abstract shape rising from the interaction of these multiple gorillas receding into the background became the basis of my composition. So thinking about the shapes, thinking about how objects working together can create abstract shapes is critical to composition. Here's another shape-based composition. This was the result of shadow and light on a dune in Namibia. So there was strong side lighting at sunset. So half of the dune is in light, the other half is in shadow. That creates this really strong graphic squiggly shape, which became the basis of my composition. And then to bring it all together, I chose a position. I walked around until I got this one tree side lit by the setting sun, pinned against the dark shadowed part of the dune. And then I just walked until the tree lined up with the squiggly line of the dune, and that brought the composition all together. So thinking about the shapes and thinking about these abstract elements of color, of shadow versus light, and how all of this interacts is very, very critical to understanding composition. I think it's the most important lesson for any people who are just beginning, who are listening to this presentation, thinking about the shapes, thinking about how shadow and light can create shapes, how multiple objects working together can create these implied abstract shapes, is the most fundamental, critical thing that you can do to improve your composition skills. And I'm also going to focus tonight on what I consider to be three very important composition techniques. And they might seem a little confusing, but I think they're actually quite simple in concept. They might be difficult in execution, but these are three techniques that I try to work into a lot of my photographs. And, you know, I do mostly landscape, but I try to work this into my wildlife, my travel photography as well, street photography. These, I think, are very important techniques to help pull the viewer into the scene and to get them visually engaged in the composition. You don't need all three. Sometimes you can just use one or two of these techniques, but when I get a chance, I try to work all of them in. And I think it helps improve the way I approach photography when I'm out there making images, and also it improves the visual reaction that the viewer has. So the first technique is something I call visual progression, or putting something in between, or, you know, basically it's putting something in between you and the primary subject, or having multiple objects that help lead the viewer to create a path for the viewer, and it invites them deeper into the composition. So one way to think about visual progression is to think about stepping stones, a path of stepping stones leading into the distance, one stone leading to the next. And another technique I like to use is something called diminishing scale. And what diminishing scale is basically is that objects that are closer to you will appear bigger than similar size objects that are farther away. And the farther away an object is from you, the smaller it gets. And this is an important perspective trick that artists in the Renaissance first started using. And they realized that not only did it give their paintings depth and a feeling of three dimensions, it also invited the viewer in and got them visually engaged in the composition that they had created. So one really basic example of this idea of diminishing scale is something called vanishing point in art. And thinking about, basically looking down a road or a set of railroad tracks, the side of the road or the railroad tracks are all perfectly parallel. But the farther they go into the distance, they appear to narrow, get closer and closer, and they converge in the distance on a single point. And those parallel lines, which would otherwise be completely vertical in a flat perspective photograph or painting, in using diminishing scale, they become diagonal lines that eventually converge at a point in the distance. And this is important because basically where you've got two or more lines converging, that's going to be a very powerful place in your composition. That's going to drive a lot of visual interest into that place in the photograph.
Yeah.
And then the final technique that I like to think about, I call framing of interest. And this is basically having visual elements that might be on the edges of the image frame that hold the viewer in the image, but also might create some visual interest. Think about a bunch of like a fence around your image. And so you've got the stepping stones leading the viewer in with that visual progression. And the fence might be a bunch of wooden slats that are around the stepping stones that keep everything contained within the image. And so you can see all three of those techniques in this photograph here, taken in the Badlands of Nebraska. So I've got visual progression. You can see in the bottom, I start with this foreground, which is a bit of white clay within the otherwise brown clay stone. And there's a bunch of cracked mud. And this all leads into the background. So there's a foreground in this image, this white clay stone. And then the middle ground, you've got some more clay stone, some other shapes and textures. Then you've got the background, which is the claystone mound. And then, of course, you've got the clouds in the sky, creating another layer of visual interest. So there's this visual progression from near to far, foreground to background, from bottom to top in the image. There's also diminishing scale because I used a wide angle lens. So this mound in the background is much bigger than my foreground. The foreground was only a few feet across, this white clay shape. And the mound in the background was probably 100, 150 feet tall. But because I used a wide angle lens, because I was very close to the foreground and relatively far away from the background, diminishing scale kicks in. And the diminishing scale from foreground to background creates this narrowing of perspective. So if you just imagine these implied lines that are created going from the foreground to the background, it's a bunch of diagonal lines that converges at that background point. And this narrowing of perspective helps pull the viewer's eye in. And then finally, the framing of interest comes from the visual elements that are kind of on the outside edges of the composition, not in the center. You've got the shape of the cloud coming in from the upper right, bringing the eye down to the left side of the image. And then the eye meets this white swirl in the clay stone that brings the eye down to the bottom and over to the right of the image. And then finally, there's this bit of clay stone that pushes the eye to the formation in the background, where the eye then goes back to the clouds and starts all over again. So these visual elements frame the central areas of the composition, and they get the viewer's eye spinning around the composition. So they hold the viewer in, but also they create a series of stepping stones, if you will, that gets the eye spinning around the image, kind of creates this spiraling effect that's always drawing the viewer in, and the viewer might come back out to these visual elements that are framing the scene. But then when that happens, the eye will get spun right back into the spiral, into the center part of the composition. And this is all designed to kind of hold the viewer's interest over time.
Ian?
Yes.
Ian? Yes. Could you explain, can we go back to that photo for a moment?
Of course.
Yes. Could you explain how you got the clarity from top to bottom to top? How did you do focus stacking? Did you just use a very large f-stop? What did you do?
Yeah. So, I mean, with my landscape photos, often you'll see very sharp focus from near to far, and that can be accomplished either through setting your lens to the hyperfocal point and then stopping down using a small aperture, Focus stacking is my preferred method now of getting that sharp near far focus, because it is better than using depth of field alone for a variety of reasons. And also sometimes depth of field isn't going to quite give you enough. So you need to either use like a tilt lens, which is a specialty lens, which allows you to alter the plane of focus and get that really extreme near far, or you can use focus stacking instead, which is a process where you have the same composition, the same exposure, but you just change your focus point. So you focus on the near elements, and then you focus on the mid elements, and then maybe on the background elements, and then you use the computer to merge all those together. And that gives you that same sharp focus that you could otherwise get with a tilt lens or with a very small aperture using depth of field. Okay.
How many shots was this, or would this be?
Something like this, I was actually not very close to the foreground. This white stripe in the clay was sufficiently big that my camera was probably about 3 feet away. So I actually could have gotten all of this in a single shot with depth of field. If I focus stacked this, and I can't remember if I did, I probably did. It was probably 2 or 3 images.
Okay, thank you.
But if you're really, really close, like if you're 5 inches away from your foreground, your focus stack might be something more like 7 or 8 images.
All right, thank you.
Yep. All right. So I think it's important also to provide context in your compositions. And what I mean about that, part of that is telling that story. The photograph shouldn't just be of your subject. You got to show more. And that will help tell more of a story. So, think about photographing wildlife, for example. Instead of just zooming in on the wildlife subject and making a tight portrait, you zoom out a little bit and you include some of the terrain that is around that subject. And that helps tell the story about how the subject lives. But I think it also allows you to make more visually sophisticated compositions. And what I do is I look for surrounding visual elements that are going to help take the visual design to the next level. So this is a good example of that. I made this in the city of Fez in Morocco. Was doing some street photography there. And there are these wonderful old alleys in the old part of town. And some of these alleys get really narrow. And I basically told my guide to take me to the deepest, darkest place in Fez, where the alleys were the narrowest and the darkest. I said, I want to go to the place where I'm most likely to get stabbed by a robber. And he just paused for a second and said, I know just the place. And he took me there. Of course, it was perfectly safe. I didn't get stabbed. No one was stabbed in the making of this photograph. I found this cool alley, and these alleys actually become tunnels because there's a lot of stuff thrown over the top of the alley. So it's kind of like being in a slot canyon. And you have areas where light's coming in, but it might not be direct light. You might be getting reflected light from the sky above. And that's what was happening here. You could see there is this ring of reflected light coming in. This is very blue because it's reflecting the blue sky above. And then there's some reflected light in the background as well. And so I set up on this alley, and I wanted to get a shot of someone in silhouette walking through wearing the traditional clothing. They call it a jalaba, which is these hooded robes that they wear. And the robes are actually, they're very comfortable. I bought one when I was out there and walked around for a while wearing one, and they're really cool. But I decided to give it to my guide before I left, because I really didn't imagine like walking down the street in the US wearing one of these things. So it's too bad. I wish I kept it because it was actually pretty cool. But in any event, I was waiting for someone to walk through, and I wanted to have them silhouetted against that brighter background. And instead of just zooming in on that bright background, that very small part in this overall composition, I zoomed out and I included more of the scene. So I included that ring of blue here. And then of course the silhouette of the darker part of the alley framing the whole thing. So that's creating that framing of interest that I'm talking about. There is that diminishing scale. So you've got a bunch of shapes that nest, one nesting the next, each shape getting progressively smaller. It's creating like this Russian nesting doll effect. So you've got the black outside shape, the rectangle, then you've got the blue, and then you've got another black shape that's created. And then finally, you've got that bright background creating a rectangle that frames the man in silhouette. So you've got this progression of shapes. So it creates that visual progression from near to far. it creates that diminishing scale. The shapes get progressively smaller, which creates that narrowing of perspective that draws the eye in. And it also creates that framing of interest. And the other thing I liked about going wider was that I also included this dented light that clearly isn't working. I just like the shape of it. I felt like it added a very necessary visual counterpoint to the man in silhouette below. So you've got these two shapes competing for the viewer's interest, the dented light and the man down below, and it gets the eye bouncing back and forth. And that's what you really want with your compositions. You want to have multiple visual elements that get the eye moving around the composition, get the eye bouncing back and forth. That's going to engage the viewer's interest and hold them over time. And I think it's going to be a much more sophisticated composition and more interesting than if you just zoom in on your subject alone and don't provide that very necessary context. And then one final way of thinking about all of this that I'm talking about, and then I'm going to go into some specific examples that I'm going to share with you and kind of dissect and discuss. So I invented this concept that I call visual flow. And the idea of visual flow is that you're standing, imagine that you're standing in a stream and you're looking downstream and the water is flowing past you. And as the water flows downstream, it might hit a boulder here, it might roll in an eddy current there, but it inevitably gets transported downstream. Nothing stops that flow of that water, it just keeps going. And you want to create the same visual effect in your photographs. You want to bring the viewer deeper into the composition to have this inevitable, irresistible pull that draws them into the composition. And so this is a very literal example of visual flow because I was standing in the water to make this photograph. And the reason why I got in the water to make this photograph, waded out, was because this boulder had this great shape. But if I tried to photograph it from the shore, it would be really small in the composition. So I got close and got my camera just a few feet away from that boulder to make it bigger, to make it more prominent, to create a visual juxtaposition between near and far, foreground and background, and to create that additional visual interest. And I knew that the boulder would be a really good visual anchor for my composition. It'd be the starting point, but everything else would pull the eye away from that boulder, take the viewer deeper in. The boulder's got to be big enough, that foreground's got to be big enough to pull the viewer back to start the process all over again. But all the shapes created by the white water around the boulder, by the shoreline of the stream itself, all of these are creating these lines and curves. Even the tree branches that are arcing over the scene in the background are all pushing the eye in to that central part of the composition. So all of these shapes are working together to pull the eye in. The boulder is designed to pull the eye back out, but bring the viewer to the starting point, which starts that process all over again. And so let's go through some specific examples, shots I've taken around the world that illustrate a lot of the concepts that I've been discussing tonight. So this is a scene from Olympic National Park. And here, people go out to the beaches of Olympic to photograph these beautiful sea stacks. But I think this is a good example of this idea of putting your subject in the background or de-emphasizing your subject and building the rest of your composition around your main subject so that everything is leading to your subject, but the subject's really just the focal point. It's the place where the viewer's eye is, where the viewer's attention is focused. And so here, this composition is all about the leading lines created by the ripples in the sand and the horizon lines and the shapes of the clouds. All these lines are pushing the eye or pulling the eye, depending on how you want to look at it, towards that sea stack in the background. So the sea stack is just that place where all of the visual interest is focused, and it is just the icing on the cake of this composition. But the composition is built around that main subject, and it is a wider view than just the subject alone. And that makes overall the visual design more interesting. And so the previous example and a lot of the photographs that I'm showing tonight, you'll see that the main subject might be centered within the composition, either in the central part of the image from left to right and up and down, or just maybe centered from left to right. Another way to break up the symmetry in your photographs and to introduce more visual energy is, instead of centering your main subject, you seek to put your subject off center, but then have a visual juxtaposition with some other visual element that attracts the viewer's eye, and try to get those arranged in a diagonal relationship. So here, my main subject is the lioness and her cubs walking in the grassland of Kenya, revealed by a spotlight. But instead of just zooming in on my subject and photographing the lions, I took a wider view and I included part of the moonlit sky above. So the moon is behind the clouds, and that's lighting up the clouds. They have this nice blue color to them, which is a nice opposite of the warmer tones of the lions in the spotlight. But you can see that the visual relationship between the two primary elements, the swirl of clouds around the moon, and then the swirl shape that is created by the spotlight, this is a diagonal relationship. So this gets the eye bouncing back and forth between the upper left and the lower right of the composition. And actually, if you think of it that way, there is a fair amount of symmetry in this composition. If you split it from the lower left to the upper right, the shape of the cloud, the swirling cloud backlit by the moon in the upper left, is the mirror image of the shape of the spotlight illuminating the lions in the lower right. So there is actually a fair amount of symmetry in this image, but there's also a lot of visual energy getting the eye bouncing back and forth between these two points of interest. So this is, yes.
Somebody was asking if the previous picture was an HDR shot.
No, it's a single exposure.
Okay. Wow.
So yeah, getting the exposure was a little bit tricky. So the moonlit clouds were pretty bright relative to the landscape. The landscape was completely dark. And so basically I just had to make sure that the spotlight was pretty well balanced so that it wasn't too bright because it would have overwhelmed the exposure of the moonlit clouds. So getting all that balance was a little bit tricky, but it was also critical to do so so that I have these two opposing points of interest.
Yeah, amazing. Are these on your website, by the way? All these slides?
Some of them are. Some of the photos are on my website, but the slides aren't. No.
Okay.
No. All right. So here's an image. When, like I was talking earlier about how sometimes I'll put my main subject centered in the composition, if not centered completely, at least centered from left to right. And I do that a lot because having that main subject in the center, you basically are creating all these lines or curves that are coming from the edges into the center that can be very powerful composition. It really pulls the eye in. And I have to tell people that it's okay to put things in the center of the composition, because I think a lot of times people are taught that that's bad, that putting your subject in the center is a bad idea. And it can be a very bad idea. If you just put your subject in the center, you often have a very symmetrical, static composition. But you can successfully center a subject as long as you've got stuff going on away from the center that creates visual interest and that creates visual energy. So I actually center things a lot, and it's a favorite technique of mine. And I'm here to tell anyone that it's perfectly okay to do so. Rule of thirds be damned, because the rule of thirds really hates things being in the center of the composition. The rule of thirds wants to put important objects on those third lines or at the intersection of the third lines. And I like to often put things in the middle and build my composition around there. So this is a good example. This was photographed of iceberg in Greenland in Disco Bay, which is a very cool name for a bay, but there was sadly no disco dancing on Disco Bay. In any event, I had this big iceberg in the background. I went wide, very, very wide, ultra wide perspective, 11 millimeters on a full frame camera, which is pretty wide. And the reason I did this is because I wanted to make the iceberg smaller in the composition. I wanted to get low and close to these small ice floes that were floating just outside of where my boat was cruising. And so these ice floes in the foreground are maybe, I don't know, a foot or two across. They're not very big at all. But because I had this wide angle perspective where I was close to them, they actually look as big as the iceberg in the distance. So really what was created here was this narrowing of perspective, these implied diagonal lines coming from the lower corners into the center of the composition. And as my boat was cruising through the ice, I waited for a moment where I actually had some of these ice shards in the lower corners leaning in diagonally to help, emphasize those implied lines. So you see this narrowing of perspective from the lower corners, lower left and lower right, until the upper center part of the composition. Then you've got other shapes leading the eye to that same place, the cloud coming in from the upper left, the cloud creating a line coming in from the right. All of this focuses attention on the background object, but there's enough visual interest elsewhere that the eye is pulled away and the visual journey starts all over again. So that's why getting low and close to that foreground is so important for landscape photography. Having that big foreground creates that visual tug of war between foreground and background that gets the eye moving and holds interest over time. Here is a scene from the Danakil Desert of Ethiopia, and I chose a different angle of view for this than the last photograph. So I'm at a side angle from my subject with a wide angle lens. And I did that because I knew it would create this really interesting perspective that and diminishing scale that would really help lead the eye into the composition. So I've got the leading lines coming in from the lower right, which is the patterns in the salt on the salt pan here. But that line is also a line that is created by that narrowing of perspective that you see here because of the diminishing scale. So the man is bigger than the camel behind him, and each camel is smaller. And that's an optical effect created by diminishing scale. All the camels are the same size roughly, and they're all bigger than the man. But because they're farther back, and I was using a wide angle lens, they look progressively smaller and smaller. So that narrowing of perspective creates these implied compositional lines that helps bring the eye in from right to left, from near to far in this composition, draws the viewer deeper into the scene. This is a shot that I took this summer in Iceland. They've got that very, very active volcano going on right now. And I actually made several trips to Iceland to photograph the volcano. The first trip I made, I'd never made it to Iceland. I got stuck in Germany and missed a flight because of a ticketing snafu, and because I couldn't enter Germany at the time. I was either going to stay in the international terminal for 4 days in the ridiculously expensive airport hotel, or fly back home. So I flew back home. But my second trip to Iceland, I made it out to the volcano, actually went up to the volcano 4 or 5 times. And then I had a third trip to Iceland where the weather was pretty bad. I only made it to the volcano once. But for this shot of the volcano, instead of just and I made this shot with my drone, which is, I think, the best way to photograph a volcano, especially as the lava has progressed. It used to be in the very beginning, you could hike right up to the volcano. You were right beneath it, basically, when it was erupting, which was pretty cool. You could do wide angle photography from the land, but the lava has overwhelmed some of those earlier observation points. And now I think the closest observation is like a mile away. So the drone is really the best way to photograph the volcano. And it's kind of a cool thing when you go there. There's hundreds of people watching the volcanoes, and probably like 25% of them are flying drones. So it's a little frightening thinking about colliding. You've got enough to worry about with lava coming out of the ground into the air, but then you've got to worry about other people flying as well. But turns out I don't think most people have any problems at all. So it was a perfectly fun flying experience. In any event, flew my drone over the volcano, and I was really thinking critically about the shapes. So the shapes formed by the lava flowing out of the volcano creates this nice kind of zigzag. So basically the zig starts in the lower right corner where that steam is rising. So having that steam rising was important to help emphasize that part of the composition as the visual anchor where the viewer is going to start. And then the viewer's eye follows the shape of the lava. So it zags over to the left and zigs back to the right. And then finally, there's an implied zag or zig, whatever, however way you approach that, whether you started zigging first or zagging first. So the final zig or zag is implied by the relationship between the setting sun and the volcano. So the zigzag ends at the volcano, but then the eye wants to keep going to explore the sun. So that just adds another leg to the zigzag. And so this helps create a very dynamic composition. A zigzag is a really dynamic shape. It really gets the eye energetically moving through the composition. But that bright bit of steam rising up in the lower right helps bring the eye back. That's the visual anchor that pulls the eye back and starts their journey all over again. And so no matter what I'm photographing, I'm always thinking critically about the shapes. I'm always thinking about taking that wider view instead of just getting in close to the volcano or zooming in with a telephoto lens and just photographing the volcano, thinking about how all the other elements of the landscape and what's going on in the sky, how that will create shapes that can be used in the visual design. So this is a photograph I made years ago in Sumatra, in Indonesia, photographing Sumatran orangutans. And this is a shot that I really enjoyed making. This was a mother and her infant, and she was swinging past me on the trail I was on. And she was actually relatively close as she was swinging past. So I put on a wide angle lens. In this case, I put on a fisheye lens, actually. And I did that on purpose because I wanted to make the trees look more interesting. All the trees in this shot were just a bunch of vertical lines, and I wanted to add some curviness to the shot. And so the fisheye creates this framing of interest that I was talking about earlier. So these curving lines created by the fisheye of the tree trunks in the left and the right just help frame the scene, get the eye revolving around the outside of the composition. And really, one trick to making these wide angle shots, whether it's landscape or wildlife or travel, because often what happens when you go wide, your subject gets fairly small, but you want to have something about the subject be engaging so that the eye goes there, even though that subject might be relatively small in the overall composition. So having the eye contact with the infant, the moment that the infant looked right at me, that was an important moment, helping create this very strong focal point, or what I would call a point of interest in this composition. So the eye is inevitably drawn to this place. That eye contact is very powerful for the viewer and draws them in, but the eye also wants to wander and explore all these other shapes. And no matter where the eye goes, there's something that will spiral the eye back or pull the eye back into that central part of the composition. Here's another example of just thinking abstract about the shapes. And getting creative with stuff that other people might literally walk over. So this is a scene from the Oregon coast, and I was photographing these beautiful sea stacks, and I was making some pretty straightforward photos where I just was, the stacks in the shot, nothing much else. And I thought these are really boring. So I started thinking about going wide, providing context, getting a wide angle composition, and that made the stacks much smaller. So I had to build a composition that would be visually dynamic and interesting. And what I really needed was a powerful foreground to juxtapose against one of those stacks in the background. And so I found this bit of kelp that had this really nice curl shape. It was wet, so it was reflecting the light very well. So I knew that shape would stand out from the surrounding sand. And the sun was setting behind the sea stack in the background. So it was casting a shadow over that part of the beach, over the kelp. So I knew that wet kelp reflecting light in the sky above would really make that shape stand out from that shadowed sand. And that curving shape really became the composition of this shot. That curving shape, getting in close, making it big, emphasizing it in the composition, creating that visual juxtaposition between near and far, between the bottom and the top, between the foreground, the background, the kelp, and the sea stack, was what made this shot effective. So the sea stack is the point of interest in this composition. It's become really a kind of a minor compositional element in this wide angle view. It's much, much smaller than the curve of the seaweed, but its position, its prominence in the composition is still very big. It's still a very important part of the composition, even though it's very tiny, in part because I've got the sun star, the sun setting behind it. So it creates this halo around the sea stack, this bright halo, and anything that's relatively bright in your composition will draw the eye. And then of course the shadows creating these very strong diagonal lines that are leaning in and converging, creating that vanishing point where the sea stack is. So all these things help pull the eye to that background point. So even though the sea stack is really small, it still visually competes with the very large seaweed in the foreground, gets the eye bouncing back and forth between these two elements, making for a more interesting composition.
Ian?
Yes.
Somebody is inquiring if you used a flash on that shot.
No, I actually did not use a flash on that shot. Just give me a moment. I'm going to take a sip of water here.
I think the question
Did
was
not use a
whether a flash was used with the orangutan.
Oh, yes. Yes. With the orangutan, yes, I did use some fill flash because it was very, very dark in the rainforest. So the orangutan would have been very much in shadow. So I used some fill flash to balance the exposure. Yeah. And here's another shot of a lion in Kenya. This is a shot that was used to flash with a snoot on it to narrow the beam, create kind of a spotlight effect around the lion. Actually, it was pretty funny. I was with another photographer in the vehicle, and we were both using flash. And this particular shot, my flash didn't fire because it was recycling. But when I triggered the shutter, my colleague was shooting, and his flash did fire. So this is actually his flash illuminating the lion, not mine. It was just pure serendipity. But I actually liked the angle of his flash better than mine, so it worked out perfectly. But this composition I was really excited about when I was making it because of the shape that was formed by the gap in the clouds. And so I went really wide with this. The lion's very small in the composition. The shape is much, much bigger. And the shape was exciting to me because it looked a lot like the bat signal. Of course, this is a good lesson in cultural relativity. So I thought it looked like the bat signal. My colleague, who is Canadian, thought it looked like a maple leaf. So did very different interpretations because of two very different upbringings. But in any event, I did love the shape that was formed by the gap in the clouds. I love the complementary colors, the blue of the twilight sky above, and then the warmer tones of the lion illuminated by the flash. And one thing that helps, so there, we've got this visual tug of war between the lion and the batwing shape or the maple leaf shape, take your pick. And once again, the lion is much smaller. So the main subject is actually the smallest part of this composition, but that lion's got a lot of visual prominence, in part because of the framing of the lion, of the shadowed landscape around it. So it creates this round shape, and the lion really stands out from that shadowed background. So that gives it more presence. It's brighter than anything else in the scene. So, the relative brightness of objects in your composition will affect how the viewer relates to them. Something that's relatively bright or more colorful is more likely to attract the viewer's eye than something that is relatively dark or unsaturated in color. And also I like the diagonal lines created by the edges of the batwing shape here. So you can see a diagonal coming from the upper left and from the upper right. And both of those diagonal lines, if you just sort of imply them and follow them down, they create a vanishing point leading right to the lion. So having those perspective lines leading to the lion gives it more visual prominence in the composition. And I think it's actually very well balanced. You can have objects that are different sizes. They can still have the same visual weight, the same ability to attract the viewer's attention. If there are other things going on, different brightness values, as I said, different color values and shapes leading to one object versus the other can all affect that visual weight. And you can balance a composition with a small object and a large object.
Ian?
Yes.
Yes, where did you put your focus on that lion shot?
I focused on the lion.
Okay.
So, with a wide angle, basically the landscape's all in shadow anyway, so I didn't really worry about the background of the landscape being in focus. And the sky, the clouds are never going to look very sharp anyways, because they're kind of puffy and amorphous. So it was very critical to have the lion be completely in focus. But because this was shot with a wide angle lens, I had a lot of inherent depth of field. So I wouldn't be surprised if we zoomed into 100%, we'd probably see that everything looks pretty sharp, even in the background. Okay, so here's a shot from Torres del Paine National Park in Chile. This is the Patagonia region of South America. And this is this shot, I think, illustrates a technique that I call shape mirroring, where I'm often trying to relate shapes to one another, repeat shapes, and to mirror those shapes. So here, I went very wide because there was this beautiful storm brewing at sunset over the mountains. And once I went wide, I had this huge cloud. The mountains go very small. They're once again, everyone's there for the mountains, but I wasn't thinking of the mountains as being the subject. The subject for me for this composition was the shape created by the cloud, and then the shape created by the curve of the incoming wave on the shoreline. And I had to just, shoot picture after picture as waves came in and out, doing half-second exposures to blur the water a little bit, because I was waiting for that perfect shape that would mirror the shape of the cloud. And these were some big waves that were splashing. Sometimes they would splash tall enough to basically drench me from head to toe. So when a big wave came in, I would just lift up my camera on the tripod way above my head. I would get wet, but the camera would stay dry. So I was soaked by the end of this, but it was worth it. I finally got a wave that created the shape that I want. So if you think about the shapes in this composition, how they work together, you've got the curve created by the cloud coming in from the upper right, and then you've got the curve created by the wave coming in from the lower left. And if you mentally connect those shapes, they create this big S curve that leads the eye from the lower left into the middle of the composition and then into the upper right. So the mirroring of those shapes working together created this very cohesive composition that brings the eye throughout the entire image frame. Here's another example. This was from a recent photo workshop I led on Lake Superior in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And you can see the shape mirroring here. You've got these interesting and colorful shapes formed by the clouds up above. And, in particular, there's one very strong curve here, but this is a radial pattern. And so I took a lot of shots of waves crashing on the rocks on the shore to mirror the shapes of the clouds. And so you've got this diagonal visual relationship between this one boulder in the lower right with the curves of water swirling around it, and the biggest cloud, the radial pattern in the upper left. So those two are kind of coming in at different ends of the composition, allowing me to create something that's playful and dynamic. And, here's a composition that I think illustrates a concept that I talk about a lot is, finding the right mix between symmetry and asymmetry in your compositions. I like having symmetry in my compositions because symmetry is pleasing, it's ordered, it's balanced. But if you have too much of that symmetry, too much order, too much balance, the composition is going to be really boring. So you've got to introduce some chaos, some asymmetry in the image, because that creates visual energy. But if you've got too much chaos, then the composition doesn't make any sense. So you've got to find the balance between order and chaos, between symmetry and asymmetry. So this composition is actually pretty well balanced from right. The boulders in the background, this is Joshua Tree National Park, are in the middle of the composition, at least from left to right. There's a big cloud coming down from the top of the image frame right down through the middle as well. So if you split the image left to right, the left side looks a lot like the right side. What brings in some asymmetry, which creates some visual energy, is this swirl in the rock in the foreground. And so, I was chasing the light for this photograph. I was working on the edge of twilight. I had this nice glow on the landscape from where the sun had set, but it was getting darker and darker. And I was at a 30-second exposure for this shot already. And so I knew that the light was fading and I was going to lose that twilight glow. And so I was running around like crazy trying to find something that would work. And then I saw this triangle-shaped boulder in the foreground with this swirl. So I got in low and close with my wide-angle lens. I filled that foreground space within the composition from left to right almost completely with that swirling shape. And that swirl is what breaks up the symmetry in the shot. It introduces a little bit of visual energy, a little bit of chaos into the composition. It gets the eye moving from left to right in the composition. It almost forces the eye out on the right side of the composition, but then that background clump of boulders and that bright cloud in the sky above brings the eye back into the composition. So that little bit of visual energy just helps push the eye around. Think of it like a roller coaster ride. And this is the part where the coaster goes down really fast and then it just sort of swings around before it levels out and the ride slows down a bit. So that visual energy gets the eye moving, pushing the eye from foreground to background, swinging around from the lower left to the right edge of the image frame, but then everything else pulls the eye back in. So symmetry versus asymmetry. You can see that in this shot. There's a little bit of symmetry from left to right. This is a Thomas's leaf monkey in Sumatra. I was taking a break from trekking with the orangutans. It's hard work tracking them, finding them, and photographing them. And so I took a 5-minute breather on the trail, and this monkey just came and sat down right next to me. And that was pretty uncommon because they're usually pretty skittish and they stay in the trees. And so I had this rare moment where I could get this extreme wide angle shot, and I reached for my fisheye because I wanted to curve those tree trunks on the left and right edges of the image. And the reason I wanted to do that was because I had the great shape already, the curve of the vine that the monkey was sitting on. And I knew that if I curved the tree trunks with the fisheye lens, that would create this swirl of interest that I was talking about, this sort of spiraling visual effect by framing the interest within the center of the composition. So the tree trunk itself in the middle divides the composition left and right. So that creates a little bit of symmetry, but this curve of the vine is kind of like that curve of that little swirl in the rock from the previous picture. It just sort of swings the eye around. So the eye starts in the lower right. You've got the leading line of the tail leading to the monkey, but then you've got this curve that just swirls the eye around, and then it hits these trees at the top of the image frame and comes down the curving tree trunks on the right side, starting all over again. And so I used a bit of fill flash at low power just to balance the exposure here. I always keep my fill flash at a low enough power that it won't bother the animal at all. Like, they don't even notice when it's that low. It's just a little bit stronger than the ambient light. They don't even blink. And that's, to me, the perfect spot, because then you're not disturbing the animal at all. And I snapped off a few shots, and then the monkey went on its way. We have the same haircut, so I think that's why he thought I was a kindred spirit. But you can see how, thinking about the shapes and making these choices about framing, about focal length, type of lens that you're using, taking that wider view, how all of this can work together and you get the shapes moving. So this is a shot from Lake Superior in the winter. Every year I go up there to photograph these ice caves that form off the cliffs that are on the coast of the southern shore. And I'm hoping that it will be a cold enough winter so that we can get out and photograph the ice caves again. And this is a self-portrait, you could tell, because I'm pushing out my chest and sucking in my gut, making me look much more rugged, manly, and handsome than I am in real life. It's also important when you're doing self-portraits to, make your face small enough or dark enough that no one can really see any of the fine details. So people can't tell how ugly I am in this photograph. And, I did this wide angle shot because I wanted to create that narrowing of perspective. So I'm pretty small in the composition, but I've got a lot of visual presence because I've got this dynamic shape that is created by the pose of me with the ice axe, pretending that I'm climbing the ice. I've got the sun right behind me, that sun star that creates that halo effect that really gives that area of the composition more prominence. And all the leading lines converge on that point in the background. So you've got the vertical lines created by the icicles, but then you've got the diagonal lines created by the shadows. And of course, the shadows aren't diagonal, they're parallel. But because I was low and close with a wide angle lens to where those shadows were coming in on the ice, I create this perspective distortion that creates that leaning diagonal line effect, that vanishing point effect. So even though I'm very small in this composition, because all of these big, bold lines created by the shadows are pushing the eye to that background space where I am with the sun behind me, I'm actually the most prominent part of that composition. And so all visual attention is really brought to that spot, but then there's enough going on elsewhere that the eye wants to wander and explore, beginning their journey all over again. Here's another example of diminishing scale. This was a scene in the desert of Nevada. There had been a flash flood, and when the water was receding, it left behind all of these sculpted mud patterns. And otherwise, this landscape was completely nondescript. There would be no reason to photograph it, but the mud patterns were beautiful. And I got low and close to the mud pattern in the foreground. I looked for one that had an interesting shape. I liked the triangle shape created by the mud pattern. I knew that that triangle with the pointy end up would create these converging diagonal lines that would help push the eye deeper into the composition. I knew that the repetition of the shape of all of these patterns in the mud would create those visual stepping stones that would lead the eye deeper in. And I knew that the diminishing scale, each shape getting smaller as it recedes into the distance, would create that narrowing of perspective. I didn't really have a point of interest in the background there was no landscape feature or anything. So I elected to shoot this with the sun within the image frame as the sun was setting in the background. I used the sun itself as a point of interest. And then, of course, the reflection of the sun in the pool of water down below helps, make things a bit more interesting, creates another point of interest, getting the eye bouncing back and forth between those two sun stars. So all of this was well thought out. And once I had the idea in my head, it was just a matter of getting the right focal length, the right position, the right time of day to bring that creative idea to its fruition.
Ian,
This is yeah.
we've got a couple questions here.
Yep.
Somebody wants to know if a fill flash was used in the ice cave shot.
No, I did not use fill flash in the ice cave shot.
Okay, and can you explain how you create the sun star?
Okay, yes, good question. So the sun star is something you can create with a wide angle lens using a small aperture. It's harder to get sun stars with longer lenses. And at some point you will reach a focal point where you can no longer get a sun star effect. And so you basically, when you shoot into any source point of light, whether it's the sun or maybe like a bright street light at night or something like that, it will create this starburst effect, but you got to use a relatively small aperture to make it look really nice. And so the key variables here are shoot with a wide angle lens and stop down to like f11 or f16 to get that starburst effect. Excuse me. Also, you can see from this shot that the sun was in the sky, nothing was blocking it. But usually if you've got the sun in its full glory, you're going to get a lot of lens flare. And I had to clean up a little bit of lens flare in this shot. I actually didn't have as much as I thought I would otherwise. Usually to get a nice starburst without getting lens flare, I try to partially block the sun with something. So you can see in this, the sun is partially blocked by an icicle. That helps reduce the intensity of the light and minimizes flare. And also having the sun on the edge of something in the scene, whether it's a piece of ice or a piece of the landscape or a tin or a sea stack or a passing cloud, that also has put something behind the sun star, so it kind of makes it stand out a little bit more. So those are the things that I do to get the sun star effect. All right, so I've been going for a while here. I'm going to try to speed things up a little bit so we can get to the end game. And I know I'm hungry for dinner. So this is a shot taken in the island nation of Vanuatu in the South Pacific. This is a volcano. And basically you could stand on the edge of the volcano looking down, and every few minutes magma would just explode out of the volcano and fly through the sky. So I knew if I did like an 8-second or a 15-second exposure, I'd get these streaking shapes created by the magma arcing through the sky. And so I set up a composition. I decided, taking my lesson to heart, that I needed to go wide and step back and provide context. I needed to put something in between me and my subject, create that visual progression. So I saw another photographer who was working. So I stepped back behind him and made him my foreground in this composition. So he is the focal point for this, and everything kind of brings the eye to him. Even the shapes formed by the clouds in the sky above create these diagonal lines that sort of push down to the man on the edge of the volcano. And then, there's all this other stuff going on. You've got the shapes of the clouds that are getting the eye bouncing through various parts of the sky. You've got the curving arcs of the magma. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on away from that primary focal point, but that's where visual interest will ultimately get focused. And once again, my goal is to always create a bit of a visual tug of war between the primary subject and other subjects within the composition, just to get the eye engaged and moving around. And here's a few shots from Badlands National Park in South Dakota, which is my favorite place in the world to make landscape photos. It is like being a kid in the candy store if you are a photographer who's interested in learning compositional skills, because there are all these interesting shapes and colors and swirls in the claystone out there. And so you can see shape mirroring going on here. I love going to the Badlands during the summer when you get all these really intense thunderstorms across the Great Plains. And the reason I love being out there in the thunderstorms is because it brings all these shapes and color to the sky that you can use to juxtapose against shapes and colors in the landscape. So for this particular shot, I had some nice sunset light on this claystone mount in the distance, this big point of interest in the background. And I also had this really beautiful swirling shape of white claystone. This is an eroded layer that's been revealed. And so that swirling shape leads the eye from foreground to background. And so I chose this composition. It's a composition I had pre-scouted. When the rainbow came out and the sunset sky started to light up, I knew that this would be the perfect shape for the shapes that are in the sky. So that curve of the foreground is a mirror of the curve of the rainbow and also the curve of that cloud coming in from the upper left of the composition. And so all the visual interest is sort of converging on that point of interest in the background, but there's so much going on that the eye is constantly just exploring and swirling around the outer edges of this composition. Here's another example from the Badlands, another cool little composition I found. I just love the shape that was created by the white claystone in this particular area. And so I knew that it would have this dynamic shape. So basically, perspective diverges at first. So it spreads out, starts in the middle at the bottom, and the white clay pushes the eye out to the left edge and the right edge of the image, but then it starts converging again into that point of interest in the background. So basically, if you think of this as creating a bunch of diagonal lines, it creates a diamond. Those diagonal lines, they first spread out, but then they narrow and bring the eye back to that point of interest. So having that spreading of perspective and that narrowing of perspective at the end, leading the eye in, can be very dynamic. And then it was just a matter, once I figured out the composition, waiting for clouds to move into position at sunset and having shapes created by those clouds that supported the overall composition. Here's just another final example. I spend days wandering through the wilderness of the Badlands to try to find really dynamic compositions. And so when I found this particular spot, once again, this white claystone, these layers that are revealed as the red claystone erodes around it, you get all of these different shapes and colors. And you can see here that, once again, you've got this perspective widening by the shapes, bringing the eye from the bottom middle part of the composition to the left edge and the right edge. And then the perspective narrows again, bringing the eye back in, creating a point of interest, a vanishing point in the background. And so this allows the composition to be visually dynamic, but also balanced, symmetrical, and ordered at the same time. So it's a mix of both. And this is another really good example of that left-right symmetry. This is a photograph of polar bears fighting in a snowstorm up in Alaska. And one thing I liked about this, it was just a blizzard. You couldn't see anything. So basically, it's this white on white image. The polar bears are barely visible from all that white blowing snow in the background. This particular composition, I opted for more symmetry. So there's less visual energy. There's more symmetry from left to right. Here is the same bears fighting, but this was a different angle. So here, instead of having that left-right symmetry, I went for that, something that was a bit more energetic. I put the two bears off the center. I balanced those bears with a generous amount of empty space, of negative space on the right. And the bears are in more of a diagonal visual relationship. Before, they are in a horizontal visual relationship, and now they're in a diagonal. They create a diagonal line, which is a bit more energetic. So these are both valid approaches. They are just very different compositions. But you can see how in one, there's more symmetry, there's more order, there's more balance, there's less visual energy. In the other, there's more visual energy, but less balance and order. And so you don't always have to have the same balance between order and chaos, or symmetry and asymmetry in your composition. Sometimes your compositions will be more ordered and less energetic, and sometimes they'll be more energetic and less ordered. Sometimes there'll be a perfect mix of both. It really depends on what you're going for any particular composition. Here's a recent photo from the desert of Utah, some random place that I go to that is completely off the beaten path. Barely anyone ever goes there. I never see anyone out there. This is a photo I took with my drone, just 20 miles away from any other person. It was just a beautiful place to fly. And I just love how all of the features in this landscape, once I chose this particular composition, once I figured it out, how it really kind of ticked all my boxes. And so you've got that visual progression. You've got all these ridges formed by the clay stone here. And so you've got, the foreground in the front, and then each ridge is repeated. There's a bunch of shapes. So there's this visual progression from near to far, foreground to background. You've got that diminishing scale, these shapes getting progressively smaller as they recede into the background. And then you've got that framing of interest. I framed this composition with this one ridge at the bottom, this ridge coming in on the left side. There's a bit of a ridge shape swirling around on the right, and all that's bringing the eye in this spiral going deeper and deeper into this composition. So you've got all these shapes coming down, just spiraling the eye in to the central part of the composition. So this was something, once I figured it out, once I discovered this place and this composition, I was really excited about it and just kept shooting it over and over again, just little variations here and there. I must have done about 20 or 30 different shots here as the sun was rising in the background, just to get it right, just to get it perfect, just to get all the shapes to work together and behave. And this is another shot from this same area. And this is a very symmetrical shot from left to right, and also from top to bottom in many different ways, because you see that shape mirroring, the radial pattern formed by the clouds in the sky. I worked very hard to find a foreground that would complement those shapes. So when I saw these erosion lines in the claystone leading down, I knew that with a wide angle lens getting close, that they would create a radial shape that would mirror the shape formed by the clouds above the sandstone feature in the background. And this butte in the background is the point of interest. It literally comes to a point. It's got a very pointy top. So I often like my point of interest in the background to actually come to that literal point, because it helps create that converging perspective, those diagonal lines that just lead the eye to that vanishing point. So everything's working together to get the eye to that background, but there's so much interesting color and shapes up in the top and in the bottom that the eye is just constantly bouncing around between foreground and background and sky. And so the eye stays visually engaged. And then for this, hold on. There we
Ian?
go. Yes. You have a question?
I've got a couple of questions here. What kind of drone camera do you use?
So I am currently using a DJI Mavic Zoom. I previously had used the Mavic 2 Pro. The Zoom was my backup, but my Mavic 2 Pro got lost in Iceland last time I was there. It tumbled into the ocean, may it rest in peace. So I'm currently using the Zoom. And rumor is that DJI is coming out very soon with a Mavic 3, and it sounds pretty exciting. So I'm hoping we'll see some real specs for that soon in a release date.
Okay, great. And somebody was commenting on the great exposure of your polar bears and wondering how you achieved that.
Yeah, that was those were actually really tricky shots, though the exposure was the easy part. Basically, I just pushed the exposure as far to the right as possible without clipping my highlights to get that high key sort of white on white effect. And it was easy because it was a snowy background, white bears, and lots of white snow flying in the sky. The tricky part of those shots was the focus. There was so much snow blowing that a lot of times my camera had a tough time focusing on the bears. There just wasn't enough visual acuity. So whenever I did lock on focus, I would tend to turn my autofocus off and then turn it back on every now and then and try to get a lock, just in case the bears had moved backwards or forwards. And that way I was able to keep everything in focus.
Okay. Do you use DSLR or mirrorless camera?
So I am currently using a mirrorless camera.
Okay. Did you put a filter on your drone camera?
No, I don't use filters on my drone camera.
Okay. That's all the questions for now.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I'm actually coming to the end of the presentation. The final image is just a shot I took recently while I was with my workshop group in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. This is just another example to bring that idea of visual flow home to you, just another in the stream looking downstream shot example. And I think this is a good example of that idea, because you can see how there is that progression of visual elements, that the foreground created by the water cascading over this drop, leading the eye into the middle ground and then into the fall color in the background, you can see this shape that basically starts off, as I was saying, with a few of my shots. The perspective is diverging, so it spreads the viewer's attention left and right. But then when you get to the edge of the shape here, the edge of the stream goes into the background. You have that diminishing scale once again, that narrowing of perspective, those implied diagonal lines that brings the eye into the background. This one curving tree that I thought was important to include in the background as a point of interest, just an interesting shape, something to have in the background as a focal point. You don't need much. So this is another just really good example of this concept of visual flow, how you bring the viewer into the composition. You want to pull them in, you want to lead their eye in. You want to create visual interest that will get them exploring different parts of the composition, but you want to have one primary point where you pull the eye, but then you want to have other strong elements that get the eye away from that primary point and start the journey all over again. When you can do that, create that revolving interest, that spiraling interest, you're going to hold the viewer's attention over time. You're going to grab their interest and never let go. And that's the goal you should have with every one of your compositions. So some final thoughts here. And I use my mean bloody lion face so that you all stand up and pay attention. These are just a few of my favorite techniques. There are a lot of tools of composition that you should learn and explore and really try to master. And all of these tools can help you make just much more compelling compositions. But none of these are ironclad rules. So don't ever think about anything I've said as being something that you have to do or as something that you can't do it in a different way than I do it. These are just tools, and any tool can be adapted to your own personal vision. And I do encourage you to explore and think about composition your own way and think about it in a different way than I think about it, because whatever helps you get to that end game of making more compelling photographs is really the important thing. And then remember what I said earlier about making photographs instead of taking them. When you take a photograph, you're just making a snapshot, and a snapshot just shows the world what your camera sees. But when you create an artistic composition, you show the world what you see. And then finally, I like to tell people, if you can see it, you can do it. If I can show you examples of composition, if I can talk about how the shapes interact and the lines and the perspective progression and all that other nonsense that I talk about, if you listen to me and you look at the photograph and you say, oh, I get it, I see what he's doing here, I see what he's talking about. If you can see that, then nothing will stop you from doing it. It may take some practice, but if you get out there and work on it, you'll eventually make it work. So please, just a little shameless self-promotion, please check out shuttermonkeys.com, the evolution of photography. Shuttermonkey is a community of creative photographers connecting passionate enthusiasts with top photo pros, influencers, and educators. You can go there and there's tons of free videos and articles, including a bunch of my video adventures around the world, taking photographs, doing crazy things. And also you can access premium ebook and video courses as well. And you can download my free ebook on the Shutter Monkeys homepage, 20 essential tips for taking better photos, that talk about some of the techniques I've talked about tonight, as well as many others. And so that's it for me for the moment. I'm going to stop my share, and now we can open to any questions that people might have.
Yeah, I think that Kenneth Mahar has a question. He has his hand raised.
Okay.
Yeah, on the one image with the kind of the pointed mountain in the background with the clouds leaning toward it, was that, did you use a neutral density filter to get a timed exposure on that?
No, actually that was a no neutral density, no filters for that at all. So it may look like there's a lot of movement and energy in the clouds in that photograph, but in reality, it was a relatively short exposure that I took there. And this is another broader compositional point that I think is worth exploring. So I'm glad you asked that question. So movement and energy in a photograph isn't created by actual movement or energy in the real world. It's created by dynamic compositional shapes. Now, you can do a long exposure to create those dynamic shapes. So if you've got clouds moving in the sky, water moving in a stream, a long exposure can blur those visual elements and they will create a shape. But whether there's this feeling of movement or energy in the photograph, that will depend on the shape that is created. So if you do a long exposure and the blur just creates a really unappealing shape, then it's not really going to create that sense of energy. So that was actually a relatively short exposure, but the cloud shapes were very dynamic. They were very energetic. And that implies energy, motion, and vitality in the final photograph.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great question.
Hey, Ian.
Hmm?
Hey, this is Rajni. I don't have a question.
Hey. Oh, hey, Rajni.
I don't have a question for you. I just wanted to share my experience taking your class since I've greatly benefited from it. I would say anybody looking to improve their game should definitely take your composition class.
Well, thank you for the plug, Rajni. And I'll see you in a few days.
Sure, definitely.
Hey, Ian,
Yes.
I got a question about your drone photography. Have you ever done any still shots off of your video, or do you always just do dedicated still shots from your drone?
Oh, it's always dedicated still shots. Though I think I would be tempted to take some extracts from video on occasion. But typically, if I'm ever shooting video, I'm shooting with a much different strategy in mind. So it's all just dedicated still shots. And the great thing about the drone is that it's like a floating tripod. I mean, they're so steady and stable that you can just choose any perfect position you want for your composition. But usually the perfect position for a still composition isn't the perfect position for a video composition. There have been times, though, when I've been tempted to extract a still from one of my videos because I'm watching the video and I'm like, oh, that actually looks pretty cool. But I've never done it and I'm not sure what the quality would be.
Thank you.
Any more questions for Ian?
I have a question about his, Ian, you mostly use wide angle lens. I didn't see hardly anything that wasn't wide angle. Am I wrong there?
You are actually very right. There were a few telephoto shots in there. I am a wide angle junkie, and you'll notice that I'm often using wide angle even when I'm shooting wildlife. I love wide angle, like that. Telephoto photography is great. I mean, I've done a lot of it. But what I really love about wide angle is that it allows you to get very playful with perspective and with the relative scale of objects within your scene. So you've noticed, and I talked about a lot, getting really close to a foreground to make it big, to make it bigger than the background. That's an example of something you can do with a wide angle lens, but it's difficult to do with other lenses. So wide angles just, they're tricky to work with because you have to find a way to make everything in the scene work together. So a telephoto lens is what I call the art of exclusion. You can basically zoom in on a intimate subject and exclude anything that's distracting. And that's something that I think is important for everyone to learn. But what I love about wide angle is that you really have to master what I call the art of inclusion, because you can't just zoom in and keep things out of the shot that are distracting. You have to get very creative with your positioning if there are distracting elements, or you've got to figure out a way to make those seemingly distracting elements work with other visual elements in the scene. So mastering the art of inclusion is a bit trickier, I think. And once you've done it, I think it just opens up a whole new world of creative possibilities. But that said, I am definitely a wide angle junkie, so I'm a bit biased towards wide angle. But I probably do 90% of my work with wide angle lenses. The wider, the better. Right now, my widest lens is a 9mm it's a rectilinear lens, so it's not a fisheye, on a full frame camera. So that's a super wide angle of view. It's so wide that I'm often struggling to keep my feet or my tripod legs out of the shot, but I absolutely love it because I can get so playful with the scale of objects in my compositions.
I see that Gary Orley has his hand raised. Gary, you have a question?
Yes, I was wondering about the next session. And then I saw the slide or something previously talked about uploading photographs. Is that for us to go off and implement your techniques and to get some feedback at the next session, or maybe a little preview of what's going on there would be nice?
Yeah, so we think of these webinars as like workshops. So the first webinar, you learn some techniques. Then we hope you go out and practice what you've learned, and then come back at part 2 and share your images, and Ian will take a look at them and give you some constructive feedback on them.
Thank you.
I give everyone the option of choosing Simon or Paula when I'm giving feedback. And that joke only works with people who have watched American Idol. It's the choice between Simon Cowell, the mean Brit, or Paula Abdul, the very nice and friendly person. So no, I'm actually always nice.
I have one more question. How much post-processing do you do with your images?
So I am, I think I'm much closer to what I would consider the traditional photography side of the scale. I haven't really embraced a lot of the really aggressive computer manipulation techniques that a lot of folks, especially, the Instagram crowd, are embracing. So I'm not swapping skies or anything like that. I work really hard to get, good compositions, good light, good subjects when I'm out there working. And to me, the digital darkroom is just there to subtly enhance the image, to optimize it, to bring it to its fullest potential. So most people, when they see my post-processing, are a little either shocked or amused to see how basic it is. I'm not a Luddite. I'm not a purist, and I do embrace digital darkroom techniques that allow you to expand your technical options. So exposure blending and focus stacking are two techniques that I use to get sharper images and better exposed images. But I'm not really embracing techniques that will cause me to fundamentally alter the reality of the scene or the subject as captured by my camera. So I'm always trying to keep that. I shot for years with color slide film, and there was no post-processing. What you did before you triggered the shutter was what made the photograph. And so that's a tradition that I still very much believe in. And I try to keep my processing as minimal as possible whenever I can.
There is a question in the chat. Do you have a favorite program for focus stacking?
Yeah, so I use both Adobe Photoshop and Helicon Focus. Helicon Focus is a dedicated focus stacking program made by a company called Helicon Soft, Helicon, and it does a really good job, though there are some scenes that it struggles with, and when I have one of those scenes, I might go to Photoshop and do it instead. So Photoshop is just it's more complicated because it's not automated. With Helicon Focus, it's a push of a button. With Photoshop, you have to take a few additional steps, but either one or the other will get me where I need to go. So both are very good, and I think both will be effective for 95% of the work that you do. And for that rare 5% where it has trouble, then the other one works just fine. So they overlap quite nicely.
Are there any further questions?
Nope.
Okay.
A lot of people are saying how wonderful it is.
Well, thank you. Always good to hear that. And I'm looking forward to seeing you guys again in a few weeks and looking at all your fantastic photos.
Yeah, Ian, do you have a deadline by which you want people to submit images, like so many days before the next seminar?
I forget, what's the date of the next seminar?
I think it's November 3rd.
November 3rd. If I can have everything by October 31st, I think that would make sense.
Okay, October 31st.
Yeah.
Make sure you're registered for part 2. I put the link in the chat and I'll put it there again. And everyone who's registered will then receive an email with instructions on uploading your image. It's to Dropbox, but Dropbox account is not required. And we also did record this session, and it will be on the N4C YouTube channel. Again, I put the link in the chat. And
Somebody was just asking if they can send questions to you, Ian.
Sure.
Where should they send those?
Well, you can just, just direct questions to me. You can email me, ianplantphoto@gmail.com. I'll be traveling in a few days and I'm pretty busy right now, so I'll try to get back to people, but it depends on how many questions I get.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's been wonderful.
All right. Thank you very much for the warm reception, and I'll see you guys soon. Good luck.
take
All
care.
right.
Thank
Good
you,
night, Ian.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Nope.
Night, everybody.
Cousin and call your sister.